before the first pale bar of sunlight breaks over the snow-capped peaks of the Absaroka Range. A bitter north wind sweeps across the frozen prairie of the Montana Territory, howling through split-rail stockades and pine-log barracks. The year is 1870. Across a lonely plateau above the Yellowstone River Valley, a sharp brass bugle call cuts through the freezing pre-dawn dark, sounding the piercing notes of Reveille. Inside low wooden barracks, 200 men stir beneath thin wool army blankets, their breath rising in thick white plumes toward raw timber rafters. The air inside the post is dense and pungent, heavy with the sharp reek of wet wool, wood smoke, unwashed canvas, black tobacco, lathered horse leather, and the sour tang of boiled army coffee. Outside the timber gates, thousands of square miles of untamed wilderness stretch unbroken toward the horizon, inhabited by roaming herds of bison and powerful native nations fighting to defend their ancestral lands. Here, at the farthest edge of the American frontier, a fragile timber community of U.S. Army cavalrymen, Civil War veterans, European immigrants, laundresses, and native scouts lives out a harsh, isolated existence, governed by strict military discipline, bone-chilling cold, and the constant threat of violent clash. This reconstruction of daily life inside a Wild West cavalry fort in Montana in the year 1870 was created with artificial intelligence based on historical studies, military records, and archaeological excavations of post-Civil War frontier garrisons. If you enjoy traveling through time to see the lost worlds of our past brought back to life, please take a moment to subscribe to the Rewind History and turn on notifications so as not to miss the journey still to come. To understand what life was like behind the timber palisades of a frontier cavalry post in 1870, it is necessary first to picture the remote geography and historical crisis of the Montana Territory. 5 years after the close of the American Civil War, the United States government began expanding its military presence across the northern plains to protect gold prospectors, telegraph lines, and wagon trails along the Bozeman route. Posts like Fort Ellis, established near present-day Bozeman in 1867, and Fort Shaw along the Sun River, were constructed not as stone castles, but as practical military bases set deep inside hostile territory. Montana in 1870 was a land of extreme environmental punishment. In winter, temperatures regularly plunged to 40 degrees below zero, sending blizzard winds screaming off the Rocky Mountains that could freeze an exposed sentinel to death in under an hour. In summer, the baking sun turned the prairie into a dry, blinding dust bowl where swarms of grasshoppers consumed vegetation, and dust choked men and horses alike. Cut off from main rail lines by hundreds of miles of wilderness, supply wagons took months to arrive from the Missouri River landings, leaving the garrison isolated from the rest of the nation for half the year. Constructed for utility, the physical architecture of a frontier cavalry fort was simple, rugged, and entirely functional, built from whatever local materials the landscape provided. Unlike European fortresses, most frontier posts in the 1870s did not possess continuous high stone walls. Instead, they were laid out around a wide, dusty parade ground where troops drilled daily. The primary building material was local green ponderosa pine or Douglas fir, felled by Army fatigue squads, squared with broadaxes, and stacked into single-story log structures. The gaps between logs were chinked with wood splints and sealed against the wind with a thick mixture of prairie mud, straw, and lime whitewash. Roofs were constructed from rough pole rafters covered with layers of split pine shingles, or in humbler buildings, packed sod and clay that leaked muddy water during spring rains. Windows were small, and glass was a rare luxury hauled in wooden crates over rough trails. Many window frames were fitted instead with oiled paper or heavy canvas shutters that kept out the wind while letting in a dim, amber light. Inside the long enlisted men's barracks, the living conditions were unadorned and cramped. A single large room housed 40 to 60 cavalrymen, lined with double-tiered pine bunk frames constructed from rough boards. The mattresses were nothing more than heavy canvas ticking sacks filled with dry prairie straw, which had to be emptied and refilled monthly to control infestations of fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Heat was provided by cast-iron belly stoves burning oak logs or dried buffalo chips gathered from the surrounding plains. But the drafty timber walls meant that, while men sitting near the stove sweltered, those in corner bunks saw their water canteens freeze solid overnight. Hygiene was primitive. Bathing took place in wooden tubs using cold river water or kettles warmed over the mess hall fire, and most troopers washed their faces and hands only once a day at long wooden troughs set outside the barracks doors. Sanitation relied on deep pit latrines, known as sinks, dug several hundred yards downwind from the living quarters, and enclosed by simple board shelters that offered minimal protection against the howling winter frost. Socially, the community assembled within the fort reflected a rigid military hierarchy, intersected by the diverse human fabric of 19th century America. At the top of the command pyramid stood the post commander, usually a major or lieutenant colonel who had commanded entire regiments during the Civil War, but was now reduced to managing a lonely frontier outpost. Below him were the company officers, captains and lieutenants, who occupied Officers' Row, a line of neat log or frame cottages featuring small porches, plastered walls, and modest brick chimneys. Next came the non-commissioned officers, the first sergeants and corporals, seasoned veterans who maintained daily discipline with tough leather voices. The bulk of the garrison consisted of private troopers, a rough mix of American-born laborers, Civil War veterans unable to adapt to civilian life, and recent European immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and England, who had enlisted straight off the docks of New York and Boston, seeking food, shelter, and $5 a month in Army pay. Beyond the uniformed soldiers, a frontier fort was home to an essential civilian population that kept the post running. Along the edge of the fort stood Laundress Row, a collection of modest log huts occupied by official Army laundresses, often the wives of enlisted sergeants. These women performed the backbreaking labor of washing hundreds of filthy wool uniforms each week in steaming copper tubs over open fires. Near the main gate stood the establishment of the post sutler, a licensed civilian merchant who ran a combined general store, saloon, and social hub. Here, troopers could buy canned goods, tobacco, pocket knives, writing paper, and cheap whiskey on credit against their monthly pay. The fort was also populated by native scouts, often Crow, Shoshone, or Pawnee men who allied with the Army against their traditional enemies, along with civilian blacksmiths, teamsters, post surgeons, and a handful of officer wives who brought piano music, china teacups, and Eastern fashions to the lonely Montana wilderness. Monotony defined the daily culinary diet of a frontier cavalry post, which was notoriously repetitive, heavy, and lacking in fresh nutrients. The core of the official Army ration consisted of three staples: hardtack, salt pork, and black coffee. Hardtack was a dense, square biscuit prepared from flour and water, baked so dry for long preservation that soldiers referred to them as worm castles due to weevil infestations. Troopers had to soak the rock-hard crackers in hot coffee or fry them in bacon fat to make them edible. Salt pork or salt beef arrived in heavy barrels packed in brine, often rancid or yellow with age, requiring hours of boiling to extract the salt. To supplement this monotonous fare, company cooks prepared large iron cauldrons of navy bean soup, cornmeal mush, and hard wheat bread baked daily in the post bakeries. Fresh meat and vegetables were rare treats that depended on local initiative. To prevent scurvy during long winters, garrison commanders organized hunting parties of skilled marksmen and native scouts who ventured out into the surrounding valleys to harvest wild game. Venison, elk meat, pronghorn antelope, and roast bison hump provided welcome relief from salt pork. Some posts established company gardens in fertile river bottoms, growing crops of potatoes, cabbages, turnips, and onions during the short summer months. At the sutler's store, troopers could spend their meager pay on luxury food items shipped from the east: canned peaches, condensed milk, white sugar, pickled oysters, and tins of sardines. Drink was equally important. While Army regulations banned hard liquor on the post, smuggled rot-gut whiskey made from raw alcohol, tobacco juice, and cayenne pepper found its way into the barracks, providing a quick, dangerous escape from the soul-crushingly tedious garrison routine. Designed for hard riding and durability on the open trail, the uniform and equipment of an 1870 cavalryman were built to endure harsh conditions. An enlisted trooper wore a dark blue wool fatigue jacket with yellow piping along the collar and cuffs, matching light blue wool trousers reinforced in the seat for horseback riding, and flannel undergarments that scratched the skin constantly. On his feet were heavy leather brogans or tall knee-high cavalry boots, lubricated with mutton tallow to repel snow and slush. In the field, soldiers abandoned rigid parade dress for practical frontier gear. Broad-brimmed felt campaign hats that shielded the eyes from the prairie sun, leather gauntlets, and heavy dark blue wool overcoats fitted with large capes that could be pulled over the head during snowstorms. Each man was armed with the model 1866 or 1868 Springfield carbine, a breech-loading rifle firing a heavy .50-70 caliber cartridge, alongside a Colt revolver. Troopers were also issued a curved steel cavalry saber, though sabers were frequently left behind at the fort during actual combat patrols, because they clattered noisily against saddles in the brush. Daily life inside Fort Ellis followed a relentless, clockwork schedule dictated by the clear brass signals of the post bugler. Long before sunrise, the first call woke the bugler, followed at 6 in the morning by Reveille, which brought troopers tumbling out of their bunks into the cold barracks. After morning roll call and a quick breakfast of hardtack, salt pork, and coffee, the garrison turned out for stable call. For a cavalryman, his horse was his life. Troopers spent 2 hours every morning grooming their mounts with iron curricombs, feeding them oats and wild hay, clearing rocks from hooves, and mucking out the long timber stables that housed up to 200 horses. At 9 o'clock, the bugle sounded for guard mount, where sentinels were inspected for clean arms and assigned to 12-hour shifts atop guard towers, at the ammunition magazine, and at the fort's main gates. Midday hours were filled with intense physical labor and military instruction. Fatigue details cleared snow, chopped cords of firewood to feed dozens of iron stoves, hauled water buckets up from the creek, and repaired timber palisades. Cavalry troops mounted their horses for daily drill on the dusty parade ground, practicing maneuvers from column to line at a trot and gallop, executing saber exercises, and conducting target shooting at wooden targets set up outside the post perimeter. At 5 in the afternoon, the garrison assembled in full uniform for retreat, standing at attention as the post cannon fired a loud blank charge, and the American flag was lowered from its high timber pole. After an evening meal of bean soup and bread, soldiers had 2 hours of free time to gather at the sutler's store, play cards, mend clothing, write letters home, or listen to fiddle music in the barracks. At 10 at night, the bugler sounded the slow, mournful notes of taps. Lights were extinguished in the barracks, and the fort fell silent under the starry cold of the Montana sky. Yet beneath the routine of military discipline lay a constant undercurrent of tension and danger. In 1870, the northern plains were a contested battleground. Treaties were frequently broken by gold miners pouring into native lands, leading to skirmishes between army patrols and bands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet warriors defending their territories. Cavalry patrols left the safety of the fort for weeks at a time, riding across trackless prairies in sub-zero cold or searing heat, living on cold rations, sleeping on frozen ground without fires, and facing the constant threat of sudden ambushes in narrow canyons. Illness was an equally deadly enemy. Post-surgeons battled outbreaks of dysentery, pneumonia, scurvy, and frostbite with limited medical supplies, relying on quinine, calomel, and whiskey in primitive log hospital wards, where infected wounds often meant amputation. By the late 1880s and 1890s, as transcontinental railroads crisscrossed the plains and native nations were forcibly relocated to reservations, the strategic necessity of small log garrisons like Fort Ellis vanished. The heavy timber palisades were dismantled for firewood, the brass bugles fell silent, and the parade grounds were reclaimed by wild prairie grass and sagebrush. Today, only stone foundations, rusted iron nails, and weathered log stumps remain scattered across the Montana landscape to mark where these lonely garrisons once stood. Yet as the wind sweeps down from the snow-covered peaks of the Rockies across the empty valley, the echo of that vanished frontier world lingers in the quiet air, preserving the memory of the soldiers, laundresses, and scouts who once lived, worked, and survived inside the isolated wooden outposts of the Wild West.